this kind invitation. Thank you all for being there. I will try in this hour and a half to explain a little bit the link between migration situations we speak about Europe, but certainly I will focus much more on the European Union, which is only part of Europe, maybe just even half of Europe. But this link between migration and the polarization, which is one of the headlines of this summer school. I will start by speaking about what was the beginning. The beginning of the current mental spirit and mood at the European Union, leadership, but also the citizens. It was the well-known "we can do it" by Angela Merkel when the refugee crisis started in 2015. So that political will in Germany, but broadly in all the European Union countries, just to open the borders to anyone who was willing or who need to come looking for, in principle, protection, international protection. We saw that, but at the same time, the countries, including Germany, were not ready for that. And it was very clearly expressed in a poll some months later when the German population felt that the government did not have full control of the situation. It was nearly 81% of the German population, so we are not speaking about the minor part of the country. It is true that the upcoming months and years made it easier just to try to minimize and neutralize the side effects of this influx. But nevertheless, the crisis went on for years, up to now. Well, as a Catholic, as a Christian, of course, we consider that migrants are primarily persons, even though Pope Leo, Pope Francis, and the previous popes have spoken all the time about migrants as persons with a face. They are not simple figures, statistics. They have a face, a project, desires. They have dreams. They have families. We know that. But in political and legal frameworks, we need to know to use categories. And one of the first steps to deal with migration is to make specific differences between the different categories when we speak about people who leave a country and enter into another country, because there are migrants or refugees when there is a border that has been crossed. If it's internal, we speak about IDPs or internal displaced persons. I'm sure that in your country, due to the war, you know it very well, this type of things. But let me just remind, for those who never saw these distinctions, which have a legal base, to tell you about the difference between the first block, which is refugee, and asylum seekers. So in some seekers, a person that applies for asylum, looks for protection in other country. A refugee is a person that applied for that protection, has been granted. And we have a legal reference, which is, as you may know very well, the 1951 Convention of the UN on Refugees and its 1976 protocol, that, by the way, have been ratified by all EU member states. It's not the same for other countries. For example, in the Middle East or in the Arabian Peninsula, they are not in the same legal boat, I would say. Another different category than refugee is a migrant. Strictly speaking, legally speaking, a migrant is not a person who looks for protection in another country, looks for a better life, better conditions, for a future, for himself, for his family, or to support relatives. That's a totally different legal concept. It is true that we speak about migrants applying the term to anyone who moves, people on the move, but we have to make this very basic distinction. A migrant is a person that is in a different legal chapter. There is no UN law about who is a migrant. There is a UN Convention of the Rights of Migrants, migrant workers of 1990, that has not been ratified by any single member state of the European Union. It's mostly, you will see, is not a very well ratified and accepted treaty, UN treaty. Very few countries in comparison to the large, nearly 200 countries and territories in the world, the international community. But we will see, if you go to the list of countries, it's mostly the sending countries, not the hosting countries. Then similar or an enlarged notion of a refugee is a person that is granted subsidiary protection. For example, if a refugee is a person who's persecuted for his opinion, political opinion, religion, race, a person who, for example, escapes the war or a violent situation can be a person that is under this chapter of subsidiary protection. Because a refugee is a person who is persecuted. But there are cases in which a person is not individually persecuted or as a member of a group, but is just in the middle of a war, of a conflict, or a violent situation. Then that person can be granted international subsidiary protection. Then we have in the European Union a different chapter that is very well known by Ukrainians living the war, which is the temporary protection. This is specifically a legal category at the European Union, which makes very easy access to the EU and to be granted immediate setting of rights, a list of rights. Yeah? Most of Ukrainians that came and escaped the war did not look for refugee status or subsidiary protection. They were under the umbrella of the EU temporary protection, which is extremely beneficial. And it has been the only case since this law, which is called the Temporary Protection Directive, was adopted. And finally, even though they are not migrants, in the migration landscape, more and more, for certain purposes, for example, the question of integration, it is included also another category, which is the category of those who are national citizens of EU member states, but have a migration background. They are second, third, fourth generation. For example, the Turkish in Germany, most of them are German citizens, maybe of third, fourth generation. The same for Algerians, Moroccans, for example, in France or in Belgium. They are not anymore migrants. They were born in the country, even their parents were born in the country. So these people are not migrants, but they have migration background that for certain purposes is helpful to explain certain situations. Over the last 10 years, we've had three main blocks of influx of migrants. When I speak now of migrants, I speak about all categories. Sometimes I use it specifically, and I will mention that. Some of the times I will use it as an umbrella term. So migrants and refugees were firstly in this 1 million peak in 2015 that shocked the EU, mostly because of the civil war in Syria, but also the instability in the neighboring countries and also in the sub-Saharan Africa. You know that all these countries like Congo, Nigeria, Niger, Mali are in permanent conflicts, in permanent jihadist attacks. So there are a lot of corruption, a lot of reasons why people leave those areas in the world. But at a certain point also from Northern African countries, mostly from Tunisia and Algeria as well. So in just a short time, 2015, more than 1 million influx of both migrants and refugees came to the shores of the EU. There was a second moment, the post-pandemic influx, because if you see any chart of influx, there will be a moment, you know, at the time of the 2020-22 pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, that influx, yes, was reduced, or it was, let's say, limited very heavily because of the restrictions in the access. And also in the movement inside the EU. It was not only the external borders, but also inside the EU and even inside the countries. So in this period of 4 or 5 years after the pandemic, you know, there were exceptionally high levels of people moving to the EU, mostly by economic reasons, by family reunification, or work permits and work visas. Family reunification is the legal title in the European Union that it's around 1/3 of all migrants coming to the EU come under the entitlement of family reunification. It means that, for example, the male comes to the EU to work, and then he brings his family to the country. Sometimes it's one spouse and 1, 2, 3, 4 children, you know. So family reunification is basically the legal entitlement more than work permits in regular migration, about regular migration, not about irregular migration. And finally, I'm not going to explain very much about Ukraine because you know it very well, 22 February. From then, a massive displacement of Ukrainians inside, but also outside, around 6 million. Many of them still remain in the EU, even though it's clear that there are a lot of movements to Ukraine, then they come back. But this temporary protection provides a very safe environment, legally speaking, for those who wanted to remain, the families. They could start, entering to the school, work, and so on. You can see here the 2015 with the 3 routes. When we speak about Western route, Eastern route, Central route, we refer to the EU. So the West route, of course, is mostly the Spanish from Mauritania that goes to Canary Islands, but also jumping from Morocco, Tunisia to France or to Spain. The Eastern route, you know very well, you know, it's mostly the Turkish, I'm talking about the southeast, Turkish to Greece, but also we also know about the Balkan route, and the Balkan route in the land that goes to Austria and so on. And the Central route is mostly the Mediterranean. Okay? The Eastern route, of course, we have also the Baltic countries, even Finland, but in terms of numbers, they are not the highest. You see that we have a quite high average of around 250,000 to 300,000, sometimes a little less. You see 1920, 21, this period is very low. And there is a big difference with 2015 that went over 1 million. In total, foreign-born residents in the EU, 64 million, out of them 20 million, more than 20 million, are either forcibly displaced persons, meaning refugees, migrants, and so on, or stateless. These are the figures of 2026, the last ones. So the reaction of the society, we've seen very different reactions depending on the moment, the country, but we have, for example, pictures here that I extracted or tried just also to make it visual, the negative reaction for those who wanted to stop or control migration. You see here on the left first, that's a very well-known bridge in London. We have the second as well from the left. This is London as well. The third one is in Poland, in Warsaw. The fourth in Italy. The same can be applied in the opposite direction. So this is first is Germany. The second is France. So what we can see that there are massive reaction in both directions. Massive reaction on the street. The question is that there are a lot of factors intervening that may explain the reasons why one block of the society is in one side and the other block is in the other side of the political sphere, but also in the understanding of migration. Of course, one of the factors that is permanently mentioned is the question of security and public order. And the argument is that usually migrants, even though most of people recognize that you cannot say that migrants are by definition, or most of them are criminals, but the other way around is the minority. But the argument is that they are significantly overrepresented among those who are either suspected or who are sentenced. And this is particularly true in the case of violent crimes. For example, the ratio is 2.6 in Germany, if you compare to the nationals, and it goes to 4 in violent offenses. This is one of the issues of security, public order. We'll see also the question of increase of sexual crimes. This is one of the important arguments for those who are taking care of the argument of migration as something to filter. You know, the argument is we have to filter to be sure who is here and to filter and trying to identify and isolate those who were criminals and basically expel them. The second element that is considered is the question of the economic and financial impact. For example, in access to housing, which is an extremely big problem in the EU, extremely big problem, not only for young people that it is, but also for not so young, for families. We have the issue of the impact in terms of salaries. They will fall in the lowest part and the non, I would say, qualified work. And of course, the question of the tax contribution, either the migrants contribute in net or are a cost finally. So some of the studies that have been some that argue are, for example, the studies in Belgium, in Germany, in Denmark, and in the Netherlands about the benefit cost of certain migration. Again, it's a matter of, let's say, generalizations or blocks. But for example, the study of the University of Amsterdam make a very big difference between the Western countries, migrants coming from Western countries and East Asian countries, that generally speaking, in the study goes not for a certain period of life, but for the whole working life. And the outcome is that in this first block, there was a positive net contribution of immigrants to the public finance of around 200,000 euros per person. The second is the non-Western immigrants that for the budget of the Netherlands was negative. Was negative of around 275,000 euros per person. I'm talking about whole life. So if the person comes and he's 25, we are talking about the 40 next year. So we can make an average, but this is the total cost. And it was particularly, let's say, burdening in the case of migrants coming from certain countries, Morocco, Horn of Africa, and Sudan. Similarly, we can say that the outcome of this study of the Ministry of Finance of Denmark was quite similar, pointed out the positive contribution of certain nationalities or people coming, probably because also not of the nationality, but the qualification, the type of job they are performing. And certainly certain countries, including in this case Pakistan and Turkey, was for the budget, national budget, was negative. Another factor is the question of the public services. Of course, when there's an influx of migrants, depending on the size of the country, the administration, the strength of the administration, the social services, education, health, and so on, but also depending on the time. It's not the same if 1 million come in 1 year that in 1 million come, of course, in 5-6 years. But at the end, the outcome is that most of the states have no possibility to match. They have no possibility. And above all, when there is a crisis or for any other reason, there is a reduction of the public incomes, the stress of the social services is more visible for the local people, and then people start to complain, let's say. Another factor which is more relevant, of course, for some than for others, and I'm just mentioning, of course, that the mix of this cocktail depends on your understanding and ideology, but all these factors are present in the argumentation. The question of identity, the ethos of the society, or as some people say, way of life, an expression that some people don't like. For example, it is quoted very frequently, this very specific, but also very revealing shift in the composition of the society. In Vienna, a traditional Catholic country like Austria, the capital of a Catholic country like Austria, right now, in the public schools, 42% of schools students are Muslims, and only 70% are Catholic. So this is a very big shift. Of course, maybe it's not the same in other areas, in other countries, but this is an expression of the argument that, of course, in the upcoming years, there will be a change in ethos because religion also has a correlation with the culture or with the way of life of the society. Another argument is the question of the political orientation. So Those who come probably in a number of years, either 5, 6, 7, 10 years, probably will get nationality. Nationality means the right to vote and then to decide also the orientation of a political community. This is something, for example, that is right now being strongly discussed in the public opinion, in media in Spain. The socialist government has decided, in one hand, to open the regularization for around 1.2 million people who are irregular migrants in Spain, and they will have the right to be regularized because of a political decision. But you have to add to this political measure by a socialist government as well what is called the law of the grandsons, meaning the following. I will explain tomorrow that Spain had a civil war in the 1930s, a civil war that was, as I will argue, mostly provoked by a radical secular ideology as well as a very strong and radical socialist positions that want to make the revolution in Spain in 1930s. The counter-reaction by the military and population brought to a civil war that was finally won by the so-called Francoists, the nationalists. So many other people from the left, socialists, communists, anarchists, many of them had to leave. Now the government, I'm talking about 1939. You see how many years have passed. We're talking about more than 80 years later. The socialist government in Spain has decided that the grandsons, grandsons, or grand-grandsons of those who left Spain in 1930s will be able to get Spanish nationality. We are talking about around 2 million people. So if you sum the 1 million people who will be regularized, plus the 2 million people, we are talking about 3 million people that at a certain point will have the 2 million for sure, immediate nationality and the right to vote. But in the upcoming, let's say, between 5-10 years, there will be 3 million people in Spain, new part of the Spanish political community, which will be decisive for the future of the country in terms of ideology. One of the arguments against the decision of the socialist government is that the expectation of the socialist government is mostly not based on idea of justice, social justice, or historical justice. But even the Popular Party in Spain argued that this is also a way of reshaping the political electorate towards the left. The final argument, of course, which is most argued by those who are, let's say, in favor of having a broad openness to migration, are the humanitarian and human rights arguments, and the question of the rights and dignity of the newcomers, either migrants, refugees, or whoever, and also emphasizing the positive contribution, the question of the diversity of cultures, and how this can lead to a society which is a richer society in terms of let's say, of ethos. It's not monolithic, it's not monochromatic, but it's more diverse. Of course, most of people are not against human rights. The question is the question of the balance between the human rights of the newcomers and the human rights of those who are already there and who are part of the political community. So the question of human rights goes many times in both directions. So, and who has the human right? There are basic human rights which are undeniable. Of course, the right to life, the life of minimum survival means, food, shelter, the question of the unity of the family. But besides that, the question here goes much more. Even some speak about the right to become national, even though there is no such a thing in any single international treaty or international law. I'm going to speak about Brexit. You know that some years ago, the voters in Britain decided to leave the EU. And one of the most important arguments was for those who defended Brexit was the question of the uncontrolled influx of migrants coming from Calais, from France, but also from other places in which the EU had a big role. So the argument was, if we decouple from the EU, we will be able to control our borders. It has not been like that precisely. And you will see here, the majority for leave in this area, top left, have a different share of income as well. So it is true that there is a significant correlation between the income of those who favor leaving the EU and those who were in favor of remaining. I think it's very interesting also the social economic profile of the voters. You see it inner London, city and so on, is upper class. The upper class, mostly the financial districts or those who have, higher incomes, were in favor of remaining. The war fear has been used massively to qualify those who are not in favor of, let's say, a generous migration policy. And I think that that's not precisely in my view, the mental state of those. I think that there was more angriness. People were angry about situations which escaped of their control, or they saw that in the past the situation was better for them, and they linked that to the current uncontrolled migration in their respective countries. Well, this is Brexit. Brexit is out of the EU, but what happens in the EU? So in March this year, there was a very important vote of the European Parliament. You know that we had in this new legislature of the European Union in 2014, there was a new parliament. So there were European elections, and in June we had this parliament that will last until 2029. So the first impact of let's say, of this reaction by many of the voters, by many of the European citizens in their respective countries, was to reject any, let's say, ideology or any political party that was highly supportive of the current status or situation, including opening of new influx of migrants. So the impact was enormous in two senses. First, the first is that the political groups were redefined in terms of categories and in terms of numbers. Before, the parliament was mostly composed by EPP, which is center-right, and the Socialists and Democrats, S&D. These were the predominant right-wing or left-wing parties. There was always a third group, either Renew Europe, which is the Liberals, the Greens mostly. And, with these groups, you can create an absolute majority. The question is right now is that the S&D, the Socialists, decrease. So the citizens decrease the support to the left-wing parties and increase the support to the right-wing parties. Not only the DPP, but also a new group emerged, which is called Patriots for Europe, which, by the way, is the third group in the parliament after the Popular Party and the Socialists. It's called Patriots for Europe. 84 deputies of the parliament. Just to let you know, Patriots was composed mostly by Orban party, that before it was in the Popular Party, plus another parties like, for example, the Spanish Vox. That, by the way, before it was in ECR, which is the Conservatives. We have the Popular Party, the Conservatives. This is the right wing. These two are not small in numbers, but usually the mainstream goes from the Socialists to Patriots. This is the mainstream politics in Europe. Okay? So there was a different composition, and the wing parties, the right-wing parties, let's say, got higher number, which is obvious in the distribution, but also a new group was formed, which is these patriots that did not exist before. The turning point was this year, in March 26. There was a regulation of the European Union called the Return Regulation that basically says that anyone who is an irregular migrant should be sent back to his country. This is called Return Regulation. For those who don't know EU legislation, the regulation is a law of the EU that has to be applied directly by all member states. This is different than the directives, in which, directives is a law of the EU that gives some, let's say, lines, and then there must be a transposition of this law into the national law. In the case of the regulation, as it is written in the law by the EU, it should be immediately applied. So the authorities do not do other thing except apply in the law. They don't have margin of maneuver of redefining the terms, of the limits, of the conditions. No. It is as it is. It should be applied directly by all 27 member states and their authorities. The question is that the traditional position of the Popular Party, which in many issues is aligned with the Socialist Party and the left, turn to another different position and align with the right-wing parties. So if the EPP aligns with the Conservatives, with Patriots and the rest, the majority is nearly double. This report, Asmani, was the return regulation. That Asmani is the name of the deputy who drafted the report, that it was counter-proposed by another MEP from the EPP from France, whose name is Xavier Bellamy. So you see the positive 418, which means EPP, all the right wing, and the rest, meaning mostly left wing plus maybe liberals and so on, 218. So the majority, it was never like that. It was never so clear. So migration right now is clearly a right-wing issue, majority issue, that of course has become, let's say, more restrictive than before. So EU policies on migration are much more restrictive. It will be in the upcoming years. The general framework of the EU is the so-called EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, that, by the way, will be fully implemented since June 26. That changes, for example, the migration influx assessment in the border. So the persons will be, under assessment, primary assessment to see if they have any chance to become a refugee, if they apply for asylum or not. If they argue in terms of asylum, but the authorities say that this is clearly not the case of asylum, they will be expelled. So there is the whole package of regulations, the whole package of legislation on how people will be filtered in the border, then how the procedures will go, which are faster. The procedure will be faster. And then the question of who has the right to remain for how long and which rights. And of course, the question of return of irregular migrants is also linked to which countries. Because some people say, okay, I'm from Nigeria, okay, but first it's costly to send them back, because you have to send them usually not by boat, but by plane. And secondly, that many countries do not accept their own citizens. So one of the pillars of the system are the bilateral agreements, the so-called international partnerships. So, the EU has to make a deal with most of countries of origin or transit of these irregular migrants. This is what we have now, the EU Pact, and we have the return package, including the return regulation, which will be the tools used just to limit and restrict and be much more tough in deciding who has the right to remain or has to leave. Because the idea is to increase the number of those who are irregular migrants. Why? Because up to now, only 1/3, only 30% of irregular migrants were sent back to their countries. It was extremely inefficient. So if you, as a irregular migrant, if you were able to reach the EU, you have nearly 70% of probability to remain. And at a certain point to be regularized and to have a life for years. That has been the wish and the desire of so many people who came here knowing that they were irregular and there was a possibility to be expelled, but actually it was not very efficient. So the whole new package aims at reinforcing the effectiveness of the return system. So this is the new normality, which is very abnormal. normality in which we have very strong blocks in favor or against certain policies, even though the majority of population in most of the countries is very in favor of a restrictive policy on migration. But the political fracture is already there, and it's not only in some countries of the EU, it's not only in the EU. I would say that it's a general phenomenon in Western countries. I mean, anyone who follows the British policies and discussions and debate, anyone who follows the US, this not only rivalry or let's say tension, but also animosity between Democrats, Republicans. This is we are in a time of a political fracture. Many factors, of course. We have seen, all these considerations that have different weight for anyone. But the risk is, in my view, a risk of the centrality of ideologies, not worldviews, but ideologies, and also the risk of populism in both directions, because I don't think that there is only one populism. Any ideology has a certain background of populistic understanding because overemphasize certain dimensions. Of course, we have in one side a very idealistic universalism and even a cosmopolitan thinking that the borders are artificial, are cultural, and there must be a primacy of the human, the dignity. So we are not entitled to restrict too much the movement of people. This is opposed to another vision, which is more realistic. For example, asking, yes, okay, fine, but do we have the means to provide with a meaningful life for those migrants? Do we have resources? Do we have accommodation? Do we have enough money in our budgets, or we have to go into debt, public debt? The question, for example, of the continuity of the spiritual heritage of a country, the question of the security, and so on. We have seen that. Of course, as I said before, the human rights play a big role in terms of argumentation. This is one of the core arguments for those who are supporting irregular migration, or for those who are supporting, let's say, the regularization of irregular migrants. But this polarization is not only a matter of difference of opinions, because in any democracy, pluralistic views are something normal. The question is that, in my view, the political opponent is seen as a threat to a society. More and more words like fascist are used just to qualify ordinary citizens who have a different view. They are called, no, you're a fascist, but why are you a fascist? No? This is very common. Or the other way around, and you are called the opposite. But more and more, we are labeling people more than discussing arguments and discussing the real reasons. And I feel and I think that in every single argument, there is a part, more or less, but there is always something that probably goes in the direction of a truth to be considered. In any of this point of security, human rights, lifestyle, all these issues that I mentioned, economic, everything has its own weight. The question is that we don't have to forget which are the primary drivers in a society. So this polarization, in my view, is also an internal debate, not only regarding the newcomers, but we are fractured, we are polarized. Migration is part of the polarization, but it's not the only thing. For example, in Brussels, it's very common to listen to the so-called EU values, which are expressed in Article 2 of the Treaty of the EU, European values. Of course, there is a list like equality, freedom, human rights, human dignity. Okay, fine. But as soon as we enter into the discussion, the views on freedom are different. On dignity, for example, I've seen how the argument of dignity, of human dignity, is used by both pro-euthanasia or against euthanasia. Or the question of marriage. Everybody wants favors marriage as an important institution. But the understanding of marriage of male-female in one single union open to children is very different from the view of others that include, for example, same-sex marriage. We have a divided society. It is true that in every country is different, the proportion, but certainly around marriage, we have a lot of divisions. or the question of religion. For secularists, religion should not have a big or important or visible position in the public sphere. Or the question of social justice, distributive justice, the question of property, taxation. There are some in favor of high taxation for all. Others say, well, look, you just crush any initiative. Or any understanding of the political community that for some is linked to motherland, fatherland. For others is just, let's say, a gathering of people, of free people, let's say, without any particular link to the notion of fatherland or motherland. So what do we have in front of us? Well, I don't see that we will find an easy, I'm not going to say a solution because I don't think there is a solution. What we can find is a path in which probably we can try to enhance the possibility of coexistence, a peaceful coexistence, and to try to widen a little bit the gap between the blocks in our societies. First of all, I don't think that we have to blame anyone who has an argument. It doesn't matter if it's more in favor or less in favor of our position. I think that every argument has to be weighed and considered, all of them, from human rights to the financial implication, and then to explain the positions and to try also to bring the concern of the others. For example, when the Catholic Church was saying, well, we have to take care of those who are coming because they are vulnerable. And then the immediate question of many were, okay, but we already have vulnerable people in our societies. We have poverty. We have 20-25% of poor people in societies. For example, in Romania, Bulgaria, Spain. So what do? We have to consider both sides, not one or the other. The second, the question of rebuilding the consensus. It is quite difficult because, as I said, at the end of the day, we are not just only giving different political opinions. I think there is a different world vision, a different cosmovision, a different understanding of what a man, a woman, what society is. And we have to widen that as well. I think that we have, and the idea of Pope Francis, for example, was to try to reinforce the idea of fraternity, with fratelli tutti. So let's appeal to what is common to all, the human dimension of any social issue, take into account the dignity, the primacy of the dignity, but at the same time take into account the reality in which we are. Because at the end of the day, the human being is not an abstract concept, like the revolutionary in France were drafting the Declaration of the Rights of the Man. It does not exist, the man. We have men, women, children, elderly. We have all of us with a common humanity, but at the same time, we have to take care of each of us in a different manner, in a different way, and consider also the cultural dimension of the reality. So we are historical subjects. We will see that tomorrow, that we don't live in abstraction, we live in a context, either in space, time, we speak a language, we have relatives. So my family is my wife, my children, others are other families that I have to take care, but I have a primary concern about my family, or I have a particular link to my country, not to another country. So all these factors should be considered in this region, and we should not expel any variable. So I will stop here, and I will be pleased if any of you want to make any comment or want to make a question. I will be very pleased just to say something which I will try to be meaningful and at the same time to match your concerns. So thank you very much.